Good evening, folks. Welcome to tonight's evening. Again, when you come in, if you could just mute yourself, we'd greatly appreciate it. I want to thank you for joining us. Again, my name is Troy Kress. I'm Keepers of the Waters Communications Manager and one of the partners for tonight's webinar. I'd like to acknowledge I'm coming in from Chimnasing, my home community, the reservation that my community was, that my people were forced onto when we were displaced from our traditional territories, what's now known as the Williams Treaty Territory, which contains a lot of pre-Confederation treaties. So if you're in Southern Georgian Bay region, parts of Toronto, west to Algonquin Park region, that's the region that I'm speaking of. And I'd like to acknowledge that, it's been settler colonization that has created this reservation system and that we are still governed under the very racist policy of the Indian Act here in the settler state of Canada. Um, Thank you for joining us this evening, and I'd like to pass it back to Jen now.
Thanks, Tori. My name is Jen Gabi, and I'm a settler. My ancestors came here from Eastern and Western Europe, and I live on unceded Abenaki territory in rural Quebec in the Eastern Townships, Abenaki territory. I am here with research for the front lines, and I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that I too live on stolen land, and I too live under the regime of settler colonialism in Canada. It's going to be a theme coming up several times tonight, so I wanted to name that. I'd like to thank our many partners who came together to make this event happen, to bring Rania to teach us tonight about a lot of important things. So I'd like to thank Keepers of the Water, the team at Research for the Front Lines, the Social Justice Center, the Climate Justice Organizing Hub, Canada Action, Climate Action Network Canada, so CANRAC, the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. And the plan for the event is that we're going to introduce Rania. Rania is going to speak for about 45 minutes on a couple of questions. How settler colonialism, genocide, environmental injustice, environmental destruction, how these things are all linked. And then she'll also speak about what the environmental justice movement can do about these things and to stand in solidarity with Palestine. And then we're going to take a couple of rounds of questions. We'll take a round of questions from each of the many partners. We'll take a round of questions from any Indigenous and our Palestinian folks that are here with us tonight. And then we'll take a round of open questions if we have time. So that's the plan. Now, I'm going to hand it back to Tori to speak for a moment about what this event means to her and the organization she's with.
Thanks, Jen. So a bit about Keepers of the Water. We are an Indigenous-led organization that protects the water and the environment. We are deeply committed to understanding and educating others that water is connected to everything. It's part of us. And without fresh, clean water, we will cease to exist as humans in all of life. We acknowledge that we are responsible for caring for water and working tirelessly to protect it. We move forward with a steadfast commitment, mindful of colonization's severe impacts and actively taking steps to decolonize our collective Water is Life movement. We do this by elevating Indigenous voices, traditional knowledge, honoring ceremonies, revitalizing Indigenous traditional ways of living, reclaiming our languages, and seeking to understand how we can embody our inherent wisdom in our work. Our organization was born on September 7th of 2006. The gathering was called because the Northern Decho River community members were alarmed by reports of increased turbidity, toxicity, and decreased water volume in their watershed. And they wanted to know what was happening with the water and the ecosystems. They relied upon it. And that event is the birth of our organization on the shores of the Decho River, and the elders from that gathering created the Keepers of the Water Declaration. And it's been my own personal research that I've been doing that, the connection of water protection. You know, there's a movement that can't happen in Palestine right now because of the violent settler colonization that's happening to the people, the ongoing genocide that's happening. We're witnessing it before our very eyes. And you know, that's the kind of colonization that happened in North America and is continuing to happen. And we're seeing the violence of settler colonization happening in Palestine right now. So, you know, and there, it's a huge water issue. There's a huge water shortage right now for people, even before um, October, you know, even before then, the water issue has been ongoing in Palestine, and they've been deprived of just clean, fresh water to thrive as a society. And we're all connected by water. So, yeah, I think that's that's about enough, and I'll pass it along so Jen can introduce Rana much better than I can. Miigwech.
Thanks, Tori. So I'd like to introduce our main speaker for this evening, Dr. Rania Masri. Rania is the co-director of Organizing and Policy of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. Rania has been an activist and organizer since 1993 and a professor and researcher since 2005. She has taught interdisciplinary environmental sciences, environmental justice, and communications at the University of Balamand, University of Beirut, and the Lebanese University, respectively. Sorry, Lebanese American University, respectively. Prior to her move to Lebanon in 2005, she was the director of the Southern Peace Research and Education Center at the Institute of Southern Studies in North Carolina. Throughout, Rania has worked to bring a holistic lens to the environment and a recognition that environmental management must encompass a human rights and social justice practice and is, in and of itself, a struggle for full citizenship. In essence, it is all a question of environmental justice. Her research and activism have centered on anti-sanctions in Iraq, anti-war in Iraq and Afghanistan, anti-occupation and anti-apartheid, Palestine, environmental justice, including water and food sovereignty, pollution, land rights, and civil and voting rights. She served as an expert in the Court of Conscience, during which she presented testimony on the environmental impact of the 2006 Israeli war on Lebanon. I had the honor of meeting Rania several years ago at a environmental justice research gathering in Istanbul. And it was a huge honor to meet Rania, and I learned a lot from her, and I've continued to learn a lot from her, and I'm looking forward to learning more from you tonight, Rania. I'll hand it over to you, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Hey, thank you, Jen. And I have to say, first of all, it is a comfort to be in a space that feels safe and feels welcoming for too many of us, marginalized and occupied populations. Just having this space in it is in and of itself something. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. I very much appreciate it. Now let me see if the sharing screen is going to be working. There we go. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. Sorry. Just okay. Just when you've gone through the and then it.
While you're working on that, is everyone hearing Rania okay? Is the sound okay? Rania's a little quiet to me.
I'm hearing her very well.
Okay, good.
Okay, now let me see. Is this working?
We're seeing your
yes?
Yes,
Yeah?
it's perfect. Yes,
Okay.
it is. Well done.
Okay. Well, let me start by saying I am both a settler and a migrant. And I feel the weight of being a settler on these colonized lands that we currently call the Americas, but the lands that I am on are the Hawaii-Saponi lands, currently known as Raleigh, North Carolina. And it is a weight and a responsibility to be a settler. And it's not enough of an excuse to simply say, I am a migrant, and so it's not my responsibility. Thank you again for this invitation. To speak about environmental justice in Gaza today, particularly, you know, I always wonder, where do I start? You're here because you've read, you've seen, you've maybe even tasted a bit of the horror that we've been experiencing for 8 months. What does it mean for us as environmental justice activists to talk about Gaza today, 8 months into the genocide? For environmental justice, it specifically means the fair and equal distribution of harms and benefits and the ability of people to have a decision in policies that impact their lives. That is the most conservative definition of environmental justice. I think for those of us here, we recognize it to be way more intersectional and much deeper, that this is a struggle against systems of oppression. So when we look at Gaza, what has been the impact of war on the lives of people? I hate to say this, but we got to start by recognizing in less than 8 months, we have had more than 125,000 people killed or injured. And I'm putting them together because for many of those injured, they will likely succumb to their wounds and will likely pass away. So we're dealing with 125,000 killed and injured. That's approximately 5.3% of the population in less than 8 months. We are witnessing a mass disabling event, and by mass disabling event, I am talking about an enforced genocide, a forced starvation, where for months now, the average caloric intake is less than 300 calories a day. So with such levels of malnutrition, many of those who are wounded, their wounds can't heal. Their wounds simply can't heal. Many of those who have undergone amputations, one of the main reasons they underwent amputations was because it took them so long to get to the hospital that gangrene set in, and they had to have their limbs amputated. So we have malnutrition and famine together taking the lives of the children and the wounded. So we can talk about the impacts on people. We can talk about the impacts on land itself. What happens to the land when white phosphorus bombs are dropped on it? When you're dealing with a weapon that continues to burn through a human body until it reaches bone? What does that do to the soil? What does that do to the plants? What does that do to the animals? We know from our research in Iraq, when the United States used depleted uranium on communities throughout Iraq, but predominantly in southern Iraq, that many of the answers to these questions, what does depleted uranium do to the land and the animals and the plants, was we don't know, but we know it's bad. So we don't know what the impacts of all this weaponry is going to be on the land, but we know already it is quite bad. And we know what the destruction of sewage facilities does to the water system and does to the air and does to the land, let alone what it does to the human populations. And of course, what does it do to climate change? Because we talk about climate. If we could just think about all the greenhouse gas emissions that are released from the weapons transfer from the United States to Israel, that alone is quite significant. So significant that research stated that carbon dioxide just from the aircraft, missions, tanks, and fuel from vehicles, predominantly from the making and setting aside the making and exploding of bombs, just from the transportation, was equivalent to burning at least 150,000 tons of coal. And that is just in the first 60 days of the war. And we are at more than 200 days of the genocide. But to me, if I talk about all that, I'm missing the heart of the problem. We could talk about the myriad of impacts on land, water, and air. I could tell you that thus far, 200 days into the war, more than 200 days into the genocide, the level of weaponry that's been used against Gaza is more than the atomic impact of the Hiroshima bomb 9 times over. The equivalent of 9 Hiroshimas, just in terms of the power of the weaponry. But it's much more than war. We need to recognize that the destruction began before October 8. There's a critical aspect of colonial extraction. Colonial extraction, when we're talking about pillaging of the land to build the society for those who want to step onto the land, the extraction of resources for another's use, for the use of the settler, for the use of the colonizer. We can look in detail at colonial extraction and relate it to environmental justice. We can look at toxic occupation. And by toxic occupation, here we mean the unfair distribution of harms, the way that the occupied West Bank has been used as the dumping grounds for hazardous material, for landfills, for wastewater, for a myriad of functions. Or we can talk specifically about water, because as was earlier stated, water is life. And again, all of these statistics that I'm sharing are before October 7th, 2023. We look at Gaza and we have seen from 2021, based upon data 3 years old, that 97% of Gaza's water was considered to be not fit for human consumption. 97% of that water. And if you compare how much water is left in Gaza, again, based on November 2023, this was data from before the war, because a month into the war, not much has changed. Look at that. While folks in the settler state of Israel continue to have more than their minimum needs for water, because the World Health Organization states that the minimum is 100 liters per person per day. In Gaza, before the war, they had 88. And in Gaza, just 1 month into the war, they had 3 liters of water per person per day. Now, this is the water that's supposed to cover everything: your cooking needs, your hydration, your hygiene, everything. And this was just 1 month into the war. Now we're 8 months into it. But it's not just in Gaza, because we also need to recognize that the West Bank has been occupied. And there is a massive, unfair and unequal distribution of water in the West Bank. And here, of course, when we think of London and visualizing Palestine, did a wonderful comparison between the West Bank and London, because when we think of London, we think of rain. Well, Ramallah and the West Bank has more water than in London, and yet I tried to survive on the minimal amount that the Palestinians in the occupied territories of Ramallah have for all their needs, and I could not. I simply could not deal with the hygiene, the cleaning, and the taking care of myself with the minimal amount of water that they have. And that's because the settler state steals the water from underneath their land, actually pours cement into their water wells. I can't imagine the horror, the amount of hatred someone must have to another to pour cement into the water wells. And this has been ongoing for years in the West Bank. And all of this, again, like I said, is predominantly before the beginning of the genocide. So it's more than just environmental injustice. And it's more than just war, because it's war with a specific purpose. It's war with the purpose of settler colonialism. This is the textbook definition of settler colonialism. Colonizers and settlers invade and occupy territory to permanently replace the existing society with the society of the colonizers. Now, if you're going to argue, wait, this isn't the aspect and this isn't what's happening, because actually, you know, when the European settlers came to Palestine, they wanted to live with the indigenous community. Actually, not at all. And we have from 1947 ongoing ethnic cleansing that has been the case for Palestinians. Started with this philosophy: a land without a people, for a people without a land. So if we understand this concept, that one, the Zionist philosophy was that Jewish, followers of the Jewish religion are a people and need to have a separate land than their current nationalities, and that Palestine is a land without a people. What does that actually mean? What does this philosophy, this embodiment of Zionism actually mean? It means that people are erased. There becomes an erasure. So how does that erasure translate? It means that when the settler comes into the land, the settler does not see the people as worthy of life, but rather starts to see the natives as weeds to be removed. And it is because they are seen as weeds to be removed that we have had Israeli military officials time and time again refer to the Palestinians in Gaza as mowing the lawn. We have to go to war against the Palestinians in Gaza to, quote, mow the lawn. Again, this has been the language that's been used against Palestinians in Gaza for the past 17 years. But it goes beyond that. When you erase a people, you erase their identity, which means that Palestinians throughout the land of Palestine have not been regarded as Palestinians by the settler state of Israel. Rather, they are viewed either as Arabs, which they are, but it's not all that they are. But by viewing them as Arabs means we deny them their essential identity of Palestinians, or they are viewed as from the West Bank or from Gaza. But they are first and foremost Palestinians. Not only is their identity removed, but their culture is also removed. Their food is stolen. So now we hear discussions of Israeli hummus and Israeli falafel and Israeli shawarma and Israeli dabki, and they've even taken the kufiya, the Palestinian kufiya, they've changed it. They've changed our symbolism in the kufiya and they've replaced it with the Star of David. They've changed our colors from black and white and replaced it with blue and white. Here we have not only an erasure of our culture, of our food, but a replacement of it, a theft of the culture and the food with that of the settler state. I'm sure much of this sounds familiar to folks. And Canada has a role to play here because in the process of coming into the lands, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the settlers mostly came from Europe, somewhat from the United States, but the primary settlers first came from Europe. They came to the land, they saw our heterogeneous forest of different Italian stone pine, Pinus pinea, Pinus brutia, Pinus halepensis, and they said, no, that's not the pine tree that we like. And they brought in the European pine tree, which is a much faster growing tree, which means it steals a lot more water than the native trees. And they removed the heterogeneous forest and they replaced it with a homogeneous pine tree, a monoculture of a pine tree. And they used that pine tree specifically. They planted it specifically on the displaced villages of the Palestinians that were thrown out of their homes, mostly by force, in 1947 and 1948. And they've been using that system ever since. Now, the main force that's been using this is an organization called the Jewish National Fund, which has full charity status in Canada, as it does in the United States. And it claims to, plant trees. We're just planting trees. Now, let alone that they're planting monocultures of trees, but they're also planting these trees to operate as soldiers, prohibiting Palestinians from returning to their lands. One of the largest of these parks is a park called Canada Park, Ayolan Canada Park, that is in the West Bank, built over the Palestinian villages of Imwas, Yalu, and Beit Nuba, all of which were destroyed in 1948. So we see even the erasure of the landscape itself, the land itself, the erasure of the landscape itself. And amidst all this, of course, a powerful example of erasure is, in fact, green colonialism. And it's really interesting when we look at the narrative here. And if we compare it to the narrative of the European settler when they came to North America, when the European settlers came to the land, this current land, to Turtle Island, they came and they said, oh my God, look at these savages who are here. They have left their land uncultivated. And because they have left their land uncultivated, this is land that is wasted. This was the language that was specifically used. If we compare that language with the language of the Zionists when they came to Palestine, they said, oh, we're going to make the desert bloom, failing to recognize that Palestinians had been farmers in the land for thousands and thousands of years, and that Palestinians had been employing common lands where there wasn't this kind of private ownership, but there was a common land ownership where their goats could travel and their farms could change. All of that was set aside with the greenwashing used against Palestinians, that they don't know how to take care of their land. We erase the land, we erase the villages, we erase the land, we plant on top of it non-native flora, and we say that we have increased reforestation in the land of Palestine. Very powerful examples of green colonialism. What's needed to do all this, to do all of these kinds of erasure, of course, is a particular narrative. A narrative that denies the indigenous communities their humanity. A narrative that has reached such a stage that the Atlantic Just earlier, just a few days ago, the Atlantic Journal came up with a term called a legally killed child, that Israel is legally killing children. The narrative has reached such an aspect that the BBC looked at the last massacre that happened 2 days ago in Rafah, in which more than 45 people were burned in the tents, and said that was not a bloodbath. But 8 people killed in a massacre in Ukraine, that was considered a bloodbath. So to work with this erasure of people's lands and their culture and their history, it must be accompanied by an erasure of our humanity, an erasure of our right to live. That is the narrative that goes with it. Of course, there becomes on top of that another narrative which says that it is only the settler state that has the right to law and the right to self-defense and the right to morality. So naturally, we get genocide. What else could we get if we have a philosophy of settler colonialism wanting to remove the indigenous population, coupled with the philosophy that supports that? Of course, we're going to get genocide. The deliberate destruction of a community. It's really hard to use these terms and to think about what's happening right now, so forgive me if I falter. Israel's relationship to Gaza is quite particular because Gaza has always been the bastion of resistance. Gaza Strip didn't even exist, by the way, in its current form. It was known in cities. But the vast majority of the residents of Gaza today are refugees from 1948. They were expelled from their villages. And then there was an attack on them. They were massacred in 1956. And then they were expelled again in 1967. And then they were occupied in 1967. Then there was a mass torture campaign against them from 1988 to 1990. Then checkpoints were imposed on them in 1991, a massive lockdown from 1994 to 1998, and then the siege imposed from 2007, and the war of 2008, 2009, 2014, and now an ongoing genocide. All of this on this a sliver of land. There is no way we can understand what's happening in Gaza today unless we tie it to the Nakba, tie it to that beginning of the ethnic cleansing that happened in 1948, when 77% of the Palestinian population were forced from their home. These are the statements of the Israelis themselves. When they say there will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, we are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. This was a statement made in October. They said it. Benjamin Netanyahu said it when he said, we will turn them into rubble. We will turn them into rubble. He didn't say we will turn their cities into rubble. We will turn them into rubble. I'm telling the people of Gaza, get out of there now. By the way, there's nowhere for them to go, but get out now. Get out where? Nowhere to go, but get out. The only thing that needs to enter Gaza are hundreds of tons of explosives from the air, not an ounce of humanitarian aid. Again, these were statements made in October by Israeli leadership, in October. And they have fulfilled their words. And I think it's important to recognize it's not just Netanyahu, nor is it just his administration, because the vast majority, quite unfortunately, the vast majority of the Israeli residents support this genocide on Gaza. There have been these banners throughout, victory equals 0 residents in Gaza. There have been celebrations of the massacres. And again, to pinpoint it into what it was, 1947 to 1949 was the heart of the Nakba. The Nakba is the Arabic word for catastrophe, when 750,000 Palestinians, and this, by the way, is according to Israeli historians and Israeli documents, when we were ethnically cleansed from our homes, the vast majority of us were torn from our homes at gunpoint. And we see it has been ongoing. It didn't stop. And now we have 85% of the residents of Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza, 85% have been expelled from their homes. Many of them expelled again and again and again and again and again. Allow me to show you what this has been looking like. that's what's been happening, coupled with erasure, genocide plus erasure, to such an extent that an Israeli soldier in Gaza actually took this selfie of himself. He took this picture of him burning books in the Al-Aqsa library in Gaza. Now, all the universities in Gaza have already been destroyed, all of them. All the universities have been destroyed. What happens when you burn people's books? What are you actually trying to destroy? You're trying to destroy their ability to create and to hold on to knowledge. This is what's happening. And there is a huge amount of impunity associated with Israeli actions. A huge amount of impunity to such a degree, that we know that Israel has destroyed every single hospital in Gaza. So you may remember the first time they attacked a hospital. October 8th, you may have remembered more famous hospitals that were attacked in November. You may have felt this horror. I remember I was screaming out loud, going, they bombed a hospital. And now they have destroyed every single hospital. They've received zero impunity for committing what even the Nazis didn't do. Zero impunity. I mean, full impunity, zero consequences for destroying hospitals. And after the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, declared that Israel has to halt its military offensive in Gaza, Israel bombed Rafah, which is the size of the Heathrow airport, by the way. Israel bombed Rafah 60 times in 48 hours. The International Court of Justice is a legally binding ruling. A nation that violates the rulings of the International Court of Justice is considered a rogue state. That's the definition of a rogue state. Now, I hope many of you have not experienced war. I hope you've never heard it, but for someone like me who has, I think to really understand what's happening, we have to hear it. So please allow me.
يا ساتر يابا البلاغ يابا يا رب البلاغات يا الله يا الله الشهيد حسبي الله
They received no consequences when they bombed hospitals. They received no consequences when we found 7 mass graves at 3 different hospitals, 520 bodies recovered. They received no consequences when zip ties so small that they barely covered an arm of a child were found in the mass graves. No consequences. They received no consequences when they bombed refugee camps in the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s in Lebanon and Jordan and Syria, when they bombed Palestinian refugee camps. And they're bombing Palestinian refugee camps. These are not even camps, these are tents of Palestinians in Gaza that were told to go to these alleged safe zones. And the fact that Israel bombed these safe zones after the ICJ ruling is horrendous. People were burned to death. There was a father who was looking for the head of his baby with a flashlight. There were children who are now writing their wills. 11-year-old Muhammad wrote a will, 11-year-old, to his mom, in which he said, "Forgive me, Mama, please don't be sad if I die." In just the past 200 days, we have witnessed the flower massacre, when they massacred children and families waiting to get flour. The tents massacre, the hospital massacres, the refugee camp massacres, the safe corridor massacres, where people were forced to walk, so reminiscent of the Trail of Tears, were forced to walk single file from northern Gaza to southern Gaza, single file. And if one of them would fall on the ground and another person would stop, they would be shot. The torture of the prisoners, the mass torture of the prisoners. We keep hearing about the Israelis saying return their hostages, but we've heard nothing of the almost 10,000 Palestinians who've been kidnapped by Israel, both from the West Bank and from Gaza, who are now being tortured so extensively that they are being used as practice for medical students in Israel. I didn't want to share with you pictures of our children who've been killed. I would rather share with you pictures of the children when they were alive.
شو اسمك؟ ميرا. اسمعني. تعطي كل واحد واحدة؟ بالحرب.
بالعيد بالعيد
A mother wrote after the Rafah massacre on 27th of May that she had left her children playing in the tent. She hugged them as it felt like the last hug. She left to cook them something to eat, and she came back panicking as she heard the airstrikes. She said, I found my 6 children that couldn't fit in the tent. They burnt and became ash. I carried the 6 in my arm as if it were a handful of sand. I continued hugging and kissing them. My 6 children, my world, they became the size of a handful of sand. I am reminded time and time again that everything that is happening in Gaza is exactly what the Israeli officials told us they would do back in October. And I remember the words of Benjamin Netanyahu, not when he was currently prime minister, but when he was formerly prime minister several years ago, when he wrote, the world will become more like us than we will become like them. And I think that is the question that we have to struggle with. Do we want more of our world to accept the philosophy and the narrative of settler colonial states that view indigenous populations as weeds to be removed and mowed away? Do we want to become more like them, or do we want to have a different world? One in which justice actually does reign, one in which there is equality, one in which no mother has to gather sand in replacement of her children's bodies. So what do we do? How do we resist? Because it is not enough to cry. It is not enough to protest. How do we resist? And to me, the question becomes, what are we resisting for? What is our demand when we resist? Are we resisting to simply call for a ceasefire? If we're resisting to simply call for a ceasefire, then we're regarding this as a war between 2 nations that we want them to stop. But this is not a war between 2 nations. This is a genocide between an occupier and an occupied population. A genocide ruled as such by the clear intentional statements of the Israeli leadership and by the rulings of the International Court of Justice that declared it to be, quote, a plausible genocide. So what do we want? If we're saying we just want a ceasefire, let us remember today, if a ceasefire happens today, the United Nations estimates that we would need 100 years to rebuild the Gaza Strip. 100 years, 3 generations of Palestinians. And that would assume that Gaza is no longer on siege, because still till now, Gaza is in siege. Gaza is in siege means that the Israeli military controls everything that goes into Gaza, from the air and the water and the land. The Israeli military, by the way, has been prohibiting Palestinians in Gaza for the past 17 years from surfing in the Mediterranean Sea. That is the extent of the siege. They are prohibiting them from importing chocolate. So what do we resist? We start by recognizing what our struggle is. And to me, it is very clear. Our struggle today is to bring down this very system of settler colonialism. Our struggle today is to reject all forms of discriminatory oppression, all forms of oppression. That is our struggle today. Our struggle today is to remember, back since 1945, it has been the foundation of international relations that genocidal regimes have no right to exist and must be dismantled for peace and security to prevail. Note, I'm talking about the dismantling of regimes, not the dismantling of people. I am talking about the creation of one state in which all are treated equally, where we all get to live as has been historically the case in the Eastern Mediterranean, where we live together, multi-religious, multi-ethnic. This is our history, not a history of mono-nationalism, ethno-nationalism. That is not our history. That is not the foundation of equality. That is our struggle, the dismantling of structures of settler colonialism. How do we do it? We research, we organize, we divest. By saying I research means, for example, for you all in Canada to recognize that Canada is one of the 10 largest countries that imports weapons from Israel. In addition, of course, to India, which is really interesting given the rise of ethno-nationalism in India. But Canada has been importing $130 million worth of weapons from Israel. Why? What warfare is Canada building, and who does it want to attack, and why import it from Israel? This is just one part of the research that can be done. Another part of the research is to recognize, well, you know, Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, I think who's best known for his yoga more than anything, said just 3 days ago, and I quote, Canada's position has been clear for many, many weeks. We need an immediate ceasefire. But then he goes on and says, Hamas needs to lay down its arms, release all hostages, but there also must be no more military operations in Rafah by Israel. Okay, so what? So we have here the military branch, the guerrilla force in Palestine. They must lay down their arms, not Israel. Israel must not lay down its arms, even though by law, an occupied population has the legal right to resist. And Israel is the one that has proven itself to be a rogue state committing genocide and ethnic cleansing. But no, we need Hamas to disarm. And note, he says Israel only needs to stop military operations in Rafah, but they can continue bombing and killing people throughout the rest of Gaza. It's just in Rafah they need to stop. I mean, the hypocrisy, the outrage of that statement. And release the hostages. Yes, I am all for the release of all hostages. And by the way, the current hostages that Hamas has in Gaza aren't really hostages, they're prisoners of war. They're soldiers. So they're technically prisoners of war. Then there's another aspect that you all could research, which is Israel bonds. Israel bonds is one of the ways that people invest in Israel and support it. And interestingly, according to the Israelis themselves, this past year has seen an increase in sales of Israel bonds, particularly to Canada. So why have there been a greater sale of Israel bonds in Canada? Who is the one purchasing these bonds? Are they cities? Are they universities? Are they governmental officials? So one of the aspects of research is to divest from all investments in all weapons manufacturers and in all, of course, Israel bonds, to divest. And part of the divestment is then to invest in systems of care, stepping away from systems of harm. That becomes one critical aspect to do in that form of divestment. And the divestment is only powerful, actually, it becomes more powerful when it's coupled with organizing. Another part of the research that needs to be done is to recognize the intersections. Palestine is just the tip of the horror. Palestine has become the laboratory for weapons, the laboratory for police brutality, the laboratory for surveillance, the laboratory for artificial intelligence usage and killing people. And that laboratory means that the Israelis are exporting that technology and bringing it somewhere else. We know that they've exported that surveillance material to the border between the United States and Mexico, and they have been using it, particularly since the reign of Obama, and more so in killing migrants as they try to cross that border. What are other intersections? Many of us recognize that the Zionist project is actually based on the European colonizations of the Americas. Based on that by system, based on that by narrative, based on that by policy. So we recognize those intersections. And we defy erasure. The whole system of genocide is built on erasing a people. So we defy that erasure. We remember who we are. We defy it through our narrative. We refuse to be the good victims, the ones that will just lie down quietly and cry as they kill us. We reject that narrative. We reject the narrative that only speaks of our women and children as if it's okay to kill our men. And we recognize how historically there have been narratives that brutalize people of color, particularly the men of people of color communities, brutalizing them to such a degree that their killing becomes acceptable. But no, we reject that. And by rejecting that, we reclaim our humanity and we refuse to have them deny us our humanity. So we reclaim that narrative. We center the narrative in its political place. We recognize Palestinians don't want charity. They want freedom. They want liberty, and they have the right to fight for it. All of these are forms of denying erasure. But we also embrace revolutionary optimism. And part of revolutionary optimism is defying the settler colonial time. A settler colonial time is this concept that time is linear. This concept, like capitalism, that wants to atomize us and put and separate us from our community and just have us think of ourselves as individuals. They want to separate us from our time, but we recognize that our time is not linear. Our time includes the past, the present, and the future. I'll give you a simple example of what I mean by that. In Palestine now, there have been more than 100 children that have been born from fathers stuck in solitary confinement in prisons, married to their wives who are out of prison. Well, how are these children being born? Palestinians have uncovered a way of sperm smuggling. They smuggle the sperm of the men out and the women give birth to the children. In that way, they are defying the past and the present to build the future. We defy the present by recognizing you all think that Palestine has disappeared. It's still here. The land hasn't gone away. Just like the lands of the First Nation communities throughout Turtle Island hasn't gone away. It's still here. It's the systems that need to be dismantled, but the land is here. We hold on to that. I desperately need to hold on to the intergenerational struggle so I can have hope to go on, given the horror of what is happening. And this genocide deserves solidarity, a real integral solidarity, a solidarity that I see in these drawings that have been made by Victor Pascal, who beautifully embodies the intersections. And I constantly remember when I was a child, 8 or 10, and I really thought that my people were the only people to have been colonized and thrown from our homes. And then when I read the history of the First Nation communities in Turtle Island, I cried because I wanted us to be the only ones. I wanted us to be the exception, thinking if we are the exception, then there is hope in our liberty, because then it shows that we are not the rule, that this is a fluke, that somehow these systems have created us and we can overcome. It took me decades to realize that, okay, we're not exceptional, but in that lack of exceptionability, there can be strength in building that struggle together, that I can learn from the history and the ongoing struggle of the First Nation communities throughout Turtle Island, and how they have maintained their identity and maintained their culture and maintained their relationships to their land, and have continued to hold on and demand land back and demand reparations and demand full equality, rather than say, I wish I were the only one so that the suffering can be less. I can recognize the intersectionality and see how together, hopefully we can dismantle these systems of settler colonialism. Together, also with other settlers and other migrants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rania. Thank you so much for all the your fierce intellectual and emotional labor that you brought to these teachings. Thank you so much. We're gonna open it for a first round of questions. I think I first want to open it up to any of the partners. So there's Keepers of the Water, there's CanRAC, there's a Climate Justice Organizing Hub, there's Social Justice Center. Anyone from any of those organizations want to ask a question to Rania, this is your chance. And you can put your, maybe indicate in the chat, or just unmute yourself and speak if you'd like to ask a question.
I don't really have a question, Rania, though I just want to say Chimigwech for sharing that your passion and the education. Like it was so fierce and it like so much hit home. I had to leave my camera off. You know, the oral history that I carry, that I'm collecting, you know, it's so difficult, you know, like I'm an ancestor, like or my I'm a descendant of my ancestors who ran from the trail of death, the Potawatomi people who were subjected to the trail of death and the single file and the annihilation of their babies and their elders, and you know, and they ran from the US cavalry and came to so-called Canada. So, you know, the parallels in our story are overwhelming, and you know, and I really do hope that Indigenous people in the settler state of Canada and the so-called US like do have give you hope and do, you know, give you something to grow from, because you know like the this, you know, it's not a struggle to make, you know, to claim our identities back, to, you know, get back to the land, to be an Anishinaabe. You know, it's none of that knowledge goes away. It always stays with us, and we can get it back. And I'm glad to help and be part of lifting up your voice. So miigwech. It's really honored to work with you tonight.
Thanks, Tori. I see your hand, Christiane. Go ahead. Christiane from the Social Justice Center at Concordia.
Thank you so much, Rania. There are so many things that you've said that I didn't even know about. I haven't heard about the awful thing that you said when you explained that the single file march. I haven't heard about that. And my question basically is, do you which media do you recommend, like which either newspaper, social media account, something like that, that we should follow to get all these information, reliable information? You think it's best for us, like from Canada, which from based in Montreal, like which source should we think is the reliable information?
Jen, do you want me to answer that?
Please. Yeah.
First, thank you so much, Tori. I very much appreciate your words and know that I can speak with such vulnerability in this space more than other spaces. In terms of media, Christiane, thank you also for that question. And I have to say, when I first was reading about the death trail, it took me several different accounts for me to actually believe it. Because not only did it remind me of the Trail of Tears, it also reminded me of the Turkish genocide of Armenians, when, which is how the word actually genocide came to be legally. I mean, not legally, but popularly. When the Turks expelled the Armenians from Turkey during the Ottoman Empire, they had them walk single file for a very long time, and anyone who fell, they were not allowed to pick them up. And they ended up in many different parts of Syria, so it also reminded me of that. In terms of news sources, there's two that I predominantly recommend. Electronic Intifada, which I'm going to put here, and Mondowise. And the reason I recommend those two is Electronic Intifada not only have journalists on the ground in Gaza, in the West Bank, in 1948 Palestine, but they also spend a lot of time reading Israeli newspapers. And what they've uncovered is what the newspaper says in Hebrew might not be the same thing that they say in English. So they have people who know Hebrew who are able to go, wait a second, hold on. So for example, from their study of Israeli papers, they discovered that there were Israelis themselves who were present in the October 7th attack, who said, no, it wasn't Hamas that shot at us, it was the Israeli military. And those were interviews that were released in Hebrew that were not released in English. And Electronic Intifada got those interviews, translated them, and presented them as like, look, these are the survivors that are saying they were actually shot at by the Israeli military. And the Israeli military was using what they call the Hannibal Doctrine. The Hannibal Doctrine is an Israeli directive that says if an Israeli is taken hostage, then the Israeli military will kill the hostage and the kidnapper. They will kill both so that the hostage will not be used as a bargaining tool. So that alone was used massively. That Hannibal doctrine was used massively on October 7th. So electronic intifada is one. Mondo Ice is another. In terms of the information that I got from the death trail, that was predominantly by following people on Twitter and Instagram, following the Palestinian voices. The main Palestinian voice that I've been following lately is a Palestinian poet by the name of Mu'taz Azizi. I'm trying to get you his handle. Here's his handle. He's a wonderful, wonderful, powerful poet, a published poet who writes a lot and becomes a megaphone also for journalists that are still able to survive in Gaza. Keep in mind that more than 140 journalists in Gaza have been deliberately assassinated. By deliberately assassinated, I'm saying Israel has come up with something called, imagine a helicopter and a drone and a machine gun all combined. So they actually follow the journalist and shoot them using artificial intelligence. So these are some. I can send you a longer list also of Palestinians still in Gaza that can be shared, that we can try to uncover the horror of what's happening. At the same time, there's a part of me that says, you know what? There's so much horror already that's been known. At one point, can we say, we know enough? We know enough to say that this regime must be dismantled, and there has to be an arms embargo imposed on Israel, and there has to be a full isolation of Israel, just like we isolated the political apartheid system of South Africa. And it was that isolation coupled with the armed resistance of the ANC that led to the downfall of the political apartheid system in South Africa. So when are we going to go that far and go beyond simply protesting in the streets, which is good, but nowhere near sufficient? And thank you, Jasmine, for listing the other ones. Yes, Middle East Eye, Breakthrough News, these are excellent networks as well. Code Pink also does a fantastic policy of magnifying the horrors of the situation. There's also, of course, I'm sorry, I'm so exhausted, I keep forgetting her name. Bisan, who is still in Gaza, who you can follow, Bisan, who's now become one of the few remaining journalists in Gaza.
Thanks for that good question, and thanks for sharing all those sources, Rania. I'm going to, last chance to any of the partners, Research for the Frontlines, the Hub, CANRAC, Keepers of the Water, Social Justice Center, anyone else from any of those organizations want to ask a question to Rania? This is your chance. Okay, not hearing any, then I'm going to hand it over to Tora to lead us in the next round of questions.
I don't have any questions at this moment.
Okay, no, sorry. I was going to hand it over to you to lead us in another round. So we were going to have another round of questions where anyone who is Indigenous or Palestinian or both to ask a question. If anyone in the audience is Indigenous or Palestinian wants to ask a question to Rania, this is your choice, and then we'll open it up more broadly. So you can indicate in the chat if you want to ask a question, or you can unmute yourself. Up to you. Okay, then we can open it up more broadly. Anyone in the anyone who is present tonight, feel free to type a question in the chat. You could type a question in the chat, or you could raise your hand. Jessica, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to express my gratitude to you, Rania. This is very hard. I can see how much this affects you, how deeply personal this is. This is also deeply personal for me. I am the granddaughter of a Nakba survivor who was brought to Turtle Island under really horrible circumstances, and who persevered and endured quite a lot, you know, when she made it here. But one of the things she did, she carried on such resilience and resistance and embedded that deeply in us. Along with a hell of a lot of trauma also. But you know, I choose to also recognize her resilience and her resistance. And so, you know, I'm looking at this from like the environmental justice movement here in what's called the United States. And I've been a part of this movement for a while now. And I have to say that I'm so grateful for you as like one of the very few voices that's out there about Palestine that I see in the EJ movement, like really consistently out there. It's been honestly really disappointing and disheartening to not see more of the connections being made, and more of the commitments being made, even to the point where I just shared something on an, you know, EJ or supposed EJ principled, you know, listserv and got shut down for it. And you know, so anyhow, that's an aside, but I just wanted to thank you and also ask you about the upcoming election. It's a little tough. I know you could speak from a personal standpoint. I know your organization is a 501(c)(3. You don't endorse or oppose any candidates. I cannot vote for a genocide enabler and supporter in Biden. And there are other candidates or other movements out there that I wish they would come together and actually have a real standing. But I just wonder what your approach is like and what you how you're dealing with, you know, many folks in EJ are like really getting a lot out of the Biden administration, right? And so it's really hard for folks to say, how do I actually move away from that? And so I just wonder what your advice is there and how to kind of navigate that.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for the many layers that you brought up and also for your very kind words. I do want to say upfront, I mean, I've shared a lot of horror, but at the same time, let's recognize the Zionist project is failing. Their plan was that our old would die and our young would forget. Yes, the old died, but the young have not forgotten, not at all. And we see that still so vibrant. I mean, I just came from the People's Conference for Palestine held in Detroit, organized by the youth. And youth, I mean, like in their early 20s, and there were 3,600 of us there, organized by a conference of the youth. The young have not forgotten at all. The Zionists assumed that their project of ethnic cleansing would rob us of our identity, remove our, they failed. They can't. It's beyond our blood. So their project has failed. And I would argue that the brutality that we are seeing right now is evidence of their failure, because it shows to me, they remind me of like a wounded animal that's in a corner with all my blessings and love for that wounded animal, but they remind me of that. Like just, so their project is failing. I can see it, I can feel it, and our liberation is coming. I just don't know when. And Najib Ali, one of the brilliant Palestinian thinkers, said, it is not a question of is our liberation close or far. Our liberation is as soon as the struggle is strong. So if we look at it that way, it shifts the whole concept of time. It's not a matter of 10 years or 20 years. It's a matter of the strength of the struggle. And we're strong. Their brutality is fierce, but I can talk at length, by the way, about how glorious the resistance is and how magnificent they are. but I want to go back to a few of the things that you stated, and I'd love for us to think about how do we build and create spaces for environmental justice activists to speak in the name of environmental justice on this issue and to make those ties, to make the ties between settler colonial projects and dispossession of land and water and civil rights and voting rights, just like that. And we've seen it in the United States. We've seen it also coupled with the enslavement project in the United States that has been ongoing into the prisons. It does the same thing. And both of those are embedded within a philosophy of capitalism, which is based on creating communities that are disposable so that we can continue to produce this economy of commodification and consumerism. The intersections are right there. They're vivid, really vivid. We just need to build those spaces. So how can we do that together? As for your question on two-part question on the election, 501c3 status aside, I'm also part of the Abandon Biden campaign. And I think politically our goal is to defeat Biden. Up front, the question becomes strategically how to do that. And I can tell you off the recording how we're planning on doing that. But our strategy is to defeat Biden. And I think part of that defeat is also recognizing, is Biden really better on environmental justice? Is he really? He supported the Mountain Valley Pipeline. He's supporting further expansion of fossil fuels. He's supporting increased militarization. How can he be better also on environmental justice when he supports war? How does that work? Yes, he threw a few $1 billion at us, but he threw more $1 billion at the corporations that are destroying the environment. So I call that greenwashing. I call that, I remember Malcolm X, who says, if you remove your dagger 4 inches from my back, don't expect me to say thank you when it's still 5 inches in my back. So Biden may be removing his dagger a little bit from my back, but it's still in my back. I'm still bleeding. And I'm saying this even with regards to environmental justice. If we want to talk about immigration rights, let's remember it was Clinton that began building the wall on the border, not Trump. It was under Obama that we had the mass removal of immigrant communities in the United States and deportation under Obama more than under Trump. And what has Biden done to that? Nothing. So I would rather have a leader who's openly vile and who stabs me in the chest than one who speaks niceties and stabs me in the back. It's easier to organize with someone who stabs me in the chest. So just to acknowledge that. The question then becomes politically, how do we build mutual aid communities to support those communities amongst us that are most at risk under the system of capitalism and imperialism and settler colonialism and militarism that is only increasing? There are communities that are barely making it. How do we support each other while we defeat Biden? How do we build political power so that we can replace them? And eventually, how do we build a better system? So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And Biden has become the king of greenwashing. So I'm not going to give him salutations there. Hope that answers your question, Jessica. And hopefully we can talk more off here. Let me throw in my email and give the floor back to Jen. I think who's going to give the floor to Sarah.
Yep. Sarah, I see your hand. Do you have a question for Rania?
I do. First, Rania, thank you so much for your time and for this presentation. It's obviously all information that's really hard to hear, but yet should be really easy for most people to see the connections between what's happening in Gaza and environmental justice. That being said, I work for an organization that is a CANRAC Canada member, and it has been a struggle. And sorry if I get emotional about this. It's been a huge struggle to get our organization to speak out in solidarity. We are an organization literally called Eco Justice. We are grounded in, a lot of colonial law in terms of like what justice means, but still justice is supposed to be at the heart of what we do. And yet our organization continues to fail us in its leadership on standing in solidarity with Palestine. And this might be, I don't know if this is an easy question, and I think I'm kind of bringing this up as a flag for any other CANRAC members who are facing something similar, who are trying to find a way for their organization to actually speak in solidarity with Palestine, and like what tools and resources are available to us as staff to push our organizations, either internally or externally. But I guess my question to you, Rania, is do you have any advice for us as we continue to push this and to continue to draw these connections for organizations who are willfully ignoring them?
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm not that familiar with your organization. I am familiar with organizations that are progressives except on Palestine. We call them PEPs in the US. And there's two ways to do that, either by building allies within the organization so they're outnumbered or shamed into that, or building another organization. It's hard. At NCEJN, I have the space because this network was built from the work of Black Workers for Justice. Black Workers for Justice, which is grounded in recognizing workers' rights, civil rights, and anti-militarism. So there's no space. This is our foundation. If their claim is, oh, we can't speak on Palestine because it's controversial, which basically means we're afraid of backlash. Okay, then who are they afraid of? And can you create a backlash for their silence that would be larger than their backlash if they took a position? So actually then forcing them to do that, then they'd be working with external and internal allies to get them to that position.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for that really good question. I think I'm really glad you asked it. And Tori, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to, yeah, I really feel for you, Sarah. It's a really difficult thing to get the organizations to even, like, I know getting settler state organizations in Canada, so-called Canada, to even make statements for Indigenous rights here is problematic. So, I have absolutely no advice because we also struggle to get people to back, Indigenous communities. And on that note, I was going to ask, I'm going to ask a question, like, how do Indigenous organizations, what resources would we use to teach our community members who don't understand those connections? Sometimes they don't understand. They're fighting uranium mining without even understanding the connection to how their fight is helping, live to protect people from the uranium that's used in wars, that's used in weapon, that is polluting, Palestine right now currently. So how do we make those connections? If there's tools available, where would we find them to share with our community members how that work is connected?
There's lots of tools and amazing leaders within Indigenous communities that I found who've made that tie. For me, what brought me closer was recognizing the similarity in language. I mean, the way the Zionists talked about us and the way the Europeans talked about First Nations, it's the same book. I mean, it felt like, hold on a second, promised land, savages, uncivilized, move them, build treaties and violate the treaties, use them as disposable workforces, build casinos on their reservations, which it's like, it doesn't stop. It's on and on and on and on and on, and then demand them to be grateful for the crumbs that we give them and tell them that their demands are not practical, that our demands need to be practical, which I hate that. It's like, if your systems of oppression are so vile that human rights become impractical, don't ask me to be practical. It's your systems that have to be dismantled, but it's the same language. It was stunning when I came across it. So that could be one avenue right there. Another avenue is to bring to the forefront those who have already made those connections within, who are Indigenous leaders who've made those connections. And I can tell you a whole range of them, particularly from, God, I'm losing my words, from Standing Rock. There was such a marriage there. But then I think there's another challenge, which is maybe a deliberate cognitive dissonance. I mean, I see it here in the United States where there are First Nation reservations that have the US flag, and I don't understand that. Where we know that in the US military, the highest proportional representation is from First Nation communities, which I don't understand that. So I could look at it from a class perspective and say, yes, there's certain levels of poverty that push people then to accept the economic employment that the military provides, which they then must accept the narrative that comes with that economic employment, which then requires a certain amount of destruction of the soul. And for me, one way to break through that cognitive dissonance is to tell them, not only is it good for your soul, but it's a winning struggle. Perhaps much of the way that we represent our struggle is one in which there's a big monster who's huge, come fight with us. That doesn't appeal to people. People don't want to stand with David against Goliath. They claim to, but they don't really want to. They want to stand with the winner. So how are we winning? How is there hope in our victory? What are lessons and ways of life that we are doing currently that are soul enriching and life affirming while we struggle to win, that can only be found in the struggle, that can't be found in the commodification lifestyle of capitalism? So here, it's not come join us so that we can fight this monster and you may lose, but come join us because in the journey itself, you will reclaim yourself and join the revolution that came before you and with you and after you that will win with you. You know, which is what I mean by this structure of revolutionary optimism, this refusal of looking at time and space as linear, which is the Indigenous history. It's not mine. It's, you know, it's the history of revolutionaries. So it becomes both of those, like all the myriad of intersections that are tangible, and then the myriad of things that are intangible that I would argue are even more vital. We live in a time where I think many of us battle suicide or thoughts of suicide, battle barely able to make it because of the horror of what we're facing and the way that capitalism makes us into atoms, like separates us from each other. So how do we build a society that connects us? You know, I'm just going to say this one thing because to me it's really powerful. Trees that are raised in a greenhouse, that are raised in pots over years, and then put in a forest, lack the ability to communicate with other trees. Now, they lack them for plant physiological reasons, but I'm just going to add the spiritual element there. That if we are raised in isolation, we lack the ability to build a community and to talk to each other, and therefore we don't know how to seek help. So how do we break through that isolation in the process of helping each other find another way?
You know, that exact point is taught Indigenous, you know, teachers and, you know, folks who want to grow medicine, you know, they want traditional medicine. They're like, well, I can just grow it in this thing, you know, and traditionalists will say, no, well, no, you can't, because it's part of, you know, it's all interconnected, and that plant needs other different kinds of plants and mushrooms and things to grow to develop into that medicine. It's all connected. We can't be separate in those separate pots, like you say. You know, we all nurture each other collectively. And, you know, our liberation is intertwined. You know, a free Palestine is intertwined with Black liberation, with Indigenous land back. It's all connected together, like, you know. So I really like that, you know, separateness. It really makes sense to me with what I've learned, you know, from traditional teachers.
I just ask people this. This was a statement I came across. Imagine if governments funded communities like they fund war and policing. Let's just start imagining that. And whenever we're in despondent, let's just imagine that we got that. And then what? You know, let's spend some time thinking of the tomorrow that we want to build to give us hope as we continue to try to build it.
I have a thought I'd like to contribute to the conversation that is happening right now. I'm really struck by your metaphor of the pot, the tree growing in a pot, and it reminds me a lot about siloed movements. And I'm thinking a lot about the climate movement in Canada, and what I've heard again and again, where the climate, some climate folks, it's less and less over these years, but climate folks still think climate crisis is too urgent to have to worry about Black Lives Matter, to have to worry about Indigenous rights, to have to like distract ourselves with Palestine. Like this like really, yeah, this I think that mindset of the siloed movements, the single issue organizing, is one of the major weakening factors. And I think your metaphor of the pot plant is such a beautiful way to describe that. And then you're imagining what would it be like for community to be funded? What would it be like for movements to organize in a way that was reaching out through the plant roots to have mutual support and to share information and to share resources. Maybe it would be so well sharing that we wouldn't need that government funding. But you know what I mean? But I just like, yeah, I feel really inspired. And I'd love to hear, yeah, your thoughts on that, Rania, and also your thoughts on some of the counter arguments to that typical climate organizing thing of the urgency of climate crisis is so big we can't distract ourselves with too much intersectionality. Can you take that down a bit?
I'll respond to that one first by saying scientifically, it's too late. We've passed the tipping point. So, okay. So if we really want to look at climate change, the only way to deal with it is to recognize it is here. The climate catastrophe is upon us. It's here. How do we build communities that are strong enough to be able to withstand the horrors that are going to come? And many of the horrors have already come. So to me, it goes beyond just, you know, because some of the climate change activists now are pro-electric vehicles, which is hogwash. And I'm deliberately using the term hogwash because in North Carolina, they're using hog shit to build electricity to then claim to use it for electric vehicles. And all it does is produce more methane and pollute the lives of the communities around it. That's greenwashing. It's horrific. We really want to solve that issue. We have to look at a different system, one of degrowth, one of living a different life, not one of electric vehicles that are dependent on lithium mining for the batteries. You know, we're not shifting harms. And so for the climate movement to actually be successful, they have to be intersectional. Otherwise, they're going to be like Al Gore and producing the brilliant documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, and then ending it with just change the light bulb. I mean, the horror of that ending was just insane. So if they actually want to be successful, that is the only way for them to be successful, for them to recognize that there cannot be a positive relationship between climate change advocacy and the military. So if there's anyone here in the Nature Conservancy, I mean you, because the Nature Conservancy has wonderful relations with the US military, failing to recognize that the US military is one of the largest polluters on climate change and one of the largest polluters worldwide on land, water, and humans. So hold on a second. So what would our economy look like if we built a peace economy and not a war economy? And to do that, we also need to defund our police and change the way the police are trained and change the way they look at Black and brown bodies, which means now we are talking about the lives of our oppressed communities, you know, locally. We are bringing that up. We can't but bring it up. David Pello has a beautiful article where he argues that Black Lives Matter is an environmental justice movement. That is the level of intersection that we need. But then there becomes the more difficult question, well, how do you actually organize? How do you actually organize successfully and organize transformationally? And how do you do it in a time period that we're living in where many of us are part of the nonprofit industrial complex, where we get calls by donors? What did you mean when you said this? You know, so how do we do all that? And how do we recognize the revolution will not be funded? So how do we take care of ourselves in the process? I mean, but these are questions that we have to answer. And maybe we can start by answering just this one question that Paulo Freire raises, which is, what do I need to do today to allow me to do tomorrow what I cannot do today? What small little steps can I do so I can be stronger tomorrow, so I can continue with that struggle? And maybe that can be our step forward as organizers. Who do we want to build a tie to? Who do we want to build an intersection with? Are there particular strategies we need to be working? How do we do it all with mutual aid? Do we want to go local? Do we want to go regional? Do we want to go national? What is within our capabilities? And all the while knowing, and this is really huge, that none of us individually can succeed in this revolution. That we are working together. that we are like those beautiful little mycorrhizae that communicate between the roots of the tree, but that alone can't do anything unless they're connected with other mycorrhizae, connected with other tree roots, which is my way of saying, let's be kind to each other and not expect that we can achieve so much within so little time. But let's just be kind to each other and recognize that we are all ripples and moving, and maybe there are changes that are happening that we're just not aware of.
Thank you, Rania. It feels like we're about 3 minutes to 8:30 Eastern time, so it's time to start wrapping it up. Tori, I wonder if you have any last thoughts, and then you can hand it to Rania for final words, and then we'll wrap up.
I think it pretty much summed up my last thoughts with the last thing that I had to say. Um, yeah, I agree that the shifting harms is a really important, topic to discuss because the work that we do, in the Arctic Ocean drainage basin to protect water that flows out into the Arctic Ocean, I mean, that work, the what's happened in Treaty 8, particularly in the tar sands region, and continues to happen and continues to expand, you know, to head to this, greenwashed transition, and be careful using just transition language or even that term. It was an indigenous term that's been co-opted by so many, non-indigenous organizations as indigenous people are silenced in the climate justice movement. Um, because we want to protect Northern Ontario and that massive boreal forest that is connected to the tar sands. It's one large forest. We don't want to see a repeat of what's happened in the tar sands region and continues to happen in Northern Ontario. The fragmentation of the boreal forest. Natural resources, what other people see as natural resources, those are our relatives, those trees, the water, those minerals. We have creation stories on what, how they got there, what they're doing, and what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to live. We are not separate from our environment. It's not just an indigenous thing, it's an everybody thing. So I think that's the most important thing, um, uh, you know, stolen Black people, Palestinians, indigenous people in North and so-called South America. We've all been removed from our environments, from that relationship that we had, as a part of nature, part of it, not above it. So I think, in your work with Indigenous people in the so-called Canada, you need to be cognizant in your climate justice work and stop thinking you have all the answers and start lifting up Indigenous voices, Palestinian voices, Black voices, and make space. Don't just use us. Get funding to hire us in meaningful, like, paid jobs that aren't entry level, contract to contract, hell, don't come to our ceremonies and try and implement it in your workspaces, get funding and hire us. We're not talking about, we'll lead the way to a just transition just to hear ourselves things. Say those things out loud, make the space for us, make the genuine space for us. That's about all I have to say. Miigwech.
Thank you, Tori, and Rania, back to you. Thank you so much, Rania. You can take it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Tori. And I just want to end with a very simple direct action that I'd like folks to do. Research your Israel bonds, research where your university, your city, your your governmental official, where your company, where your church, whoever, where they're investing their money. If they're investing in Israel bonds or they're investing in any of the weapons manufacturers, and work on that divestment, make it really, really clear. I think that's fundamental. And if you want to plan anything around June 8th, which is the 8-month anniversary of the genocide, go ahead and plan something and you can connect with folks. But the critical thing is, let's make it uncomfortable for this economy to continue, and let's hit them where it hurts. And one of the powerful tools is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, coupled with a powerful narrative that refuses the dehumanization of Indigenous communities and refuses the denial of our legal, moral, and ethical right for armed resistance.
Thank you, Rania. Thanks to all our partners. Thanks for everyone who joined us tonight. This has been recorded and we'll share it on the Facebook event as well as on the Research for the Frontlines website resources page. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Rania, from deep in our heart. Thank you so much.
Miigwech, everybody.
Thank you.